Have you ever been in a situation where someone thought they knew everything, only for them to be put in their place in a way they didn't expect? Well, that's exactly what happened on a routine flight, but the twist was unexpected. It all started when a pilot decided it was his duty to lecture a black woman on flight etiquette, something he clearly thought was his domain. What he didn't realize, however, was that his judgment would be tested in a way that would ground him permanently. Let's paint the scene for you. Picture this: a bustling airport terminal, passengers going about their business, the usual hum of travel. Among them, a woman, confident and composed, boarding a flight she thought would be just another uneventful journey. But as fate would have it, the man seated next to her, a pilot, had other ideas. He wasn't just any passenger. He was someone who had spent years flying and believed that his expertise in aviation gave him the right to correct others, even in the most inappropriate moments. The woman, simply minding her business, was quietly settling in for the flight when the pilot, with a smile that seemed too smug for comfort, leaned over to offer unsolicited advice. It wasn't about the weather or the destination, but something far more trivial. He started lecturing her on the proper flight etiquette, how she should sit, how she should behave, and how the seatbelt should be adjusted in a way that mirrored his own sense of superiority. Now, many of us have been on flights where a well-meaning person gives advice, but this wasn't that. This was condescension disguised as helpfulness, and it didn't sit well with the woman. You see, this wasn't just about some pilot giving advice. It was about a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. The pilot's tone, his assumptions, and the way he believed he could dictate someone's behavior, were rooted in a world where people, especially women of color, often face unwarranted judgment and criticism. But what the pilot didn't realize was that this woman was no ordinary passenger. She wasn't going to let his words slide. She wasn't going to shrink or let his actions go unchecked. What happened next, you won't believe. Just as the pilot finished his lecture, the woman stood her ground. But this wasn't just a moment of words, it was a game changer. Her response was something the pilot never saw coming, something so powerful, it would leave him stunned and completely grounded. But it wasn't just his job that was on the line. No, what transpired next would ripple through the flight, changing the atmosphere in ways that none of the passengers could have predicted. And so, we find ourselves on the edge of a turning point. The tension in the cabin is palpable, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The question is, how does a pilot, trained in the art of flying, end up being grounded in the most unexpected way? How does a seemingly simple interaction between two passengers lead to a permanent consequence for one of them? You're about to find out. Keep watching, because what happens next will change everything, and you won't want to miss it. As the plane slowly taxied to the runway, the atmosphere inside the cabin was anything but peaceful. The usual sounds of a flight, passengers settling in, soft conversations, the hum of the engines, seemed distant in that moment. Everything felt charged, as if the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The pilot had made his point. He thought he had the upper hand. But in truth, he was about to learn a hard lesson in humility that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The woman he had decided to lecture wasn't your typical passenger. She wasn't looking for confrontation, nor was she someone who sought attention. But there was something about the pilot's tone, the way he spoke to her as if she were an inexperienced child, that triggered something deep within her. She wasn't just a random woman on a flight. She had seen her fair share of injustice, judgment, and microaggressions in her life. Over the years, she had learned how to handle situations like these. But this time, something inside her snapped. This was different. This wasn't going to go unchecked. Her name was Maya. Maya had been flying for years, traveling both for work and for personal reasons. As a successful marketing executive, she was no stranger to the demands of business travel, but she was also no stranger to the subtle ways in which people, especially women of color, were often treated differently. In airports, on flights, and even in meetings, she had encountered countless moments where her worth was questioned, or her abilities underestimated. But Maya had learned how to navigate those spaces, using her voice when necessary and choosing silence when it served her better. But this felt personal. And it was about to become a defining moment for her. The pilot, let's call him Captain Jensen, had been flying for decades. He was used to being in control, not just of the aircraft but of the conversations around him. He was the kind of person who believed his title and experience granted him an unspoken authority over others. Over the years, he had cultivated an air of superiority that he wore like a badge of honor, convinced that his knowledge was irrefutable. His lecture to Maya had been nothing more than a reflection of his own ego, his belief that he could tell others how to behave, as though his profession gave him the right to impose his views. But what Captain Jensen didn't realize was that his assumptions about Maya were wrong. His expectations of how she should react were off. As he looked at her, waiting for her to nod in agreement or apologize for her perceived mistake, he was met with something entirely different. Maya's eyes, sharp and unwavering, locked onto his with an intensity that made him feel a slight shift in the air. It was as if the tables had turned in an instant. Maya had dealt with people like Captain Jensen before. She had endured people speaking over her, people undermining her expertise, people thinking they could take the liberty of educating her about things she already knew. But she also knew that this wasn't just about one person's arrogance. It was about a pattern, one that was woven into society's fabric. It was about people, especially black women, being constantly reminded that their voices didn't matter as much, their experiences were less valuable, and their space in the world was always negotiable. Maya wasn't going to let Captain Jensen's outdated sense of authority go unchallenged. With calm precision, she adjusted her seat, making sure her posture was straight and composed. She could feel the eyes of the surrounding passengers on her, sensing that something was unfolding, though they didn't quite understand what was happening. There was an undercurrent of curiosity and confusion, but Maya wasn't focused on them. She was focused on the man beside her. "Excuse me," Maya said, her voice steady but sharp, cutting through the space between them like a knife. Captain Jensen turned toward her, his smile still intact, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I think it's best if you save your advice for someone who actually asked for it." The words hung in the air, heavy and firm. It was clear to Captain Jensen that Maya wasn't just speaking to him as a passenger, she was speaking to him as a woman who had had enough. His eyes widened slightly, and for a brief moment, he was taken aback. He had expected gratitude, maybe a quiet apology, perhaps even a meek agreement that she would follow his guidance. But Maya wasn't having it. "I'm not sure who you think you're talking to," Maya continued, her voice low but unwavering. "But this isn't your plane. You don't get to tell me how to sit, how to act, or how to exist in a space I've paid to be in." Captain Jensen's expression faltered. He wasn't used to being challenged. He was used to people falling in line, to passengers smiling politely, nodding, and accepting whatever advice he had to offer. But Maya wasn't following the script. And for the first time, Captain Jensen felt a strange, unsettling discomfort in his own seat. His years of flying, his accumulated knowledge, his role as a captain, none of that seemed to matter in this moment. He wasn't in control here. And that thought alone made him uneasy. The seconds dragged on as he processed her words. The plane had already begun its slow roll toward the runway, the rumble of the engines filling the cabin with the hum of impending flight. But in that instant, the air felt thick with tension, as though the whole world was holding its breath. What would Captain Jensen do next? Would he apologize? Would he back off and try to recover the situation? Or would he double down, as many men in positions of power sometimes did when their authority was questioned? Maya wasn't waiting for his decision. She wasn't looking for an apology. She wasn't interested in explanations. She simply wanted him to understand something that he had clearly missed: respect wasn't a given, and neither was his authority over her. She didn't need him to validate her. In fact, she didn't need him at all. Captain Jensen's hand twitched, and for a moment, Maya thought he might say something. But then, a sharp voice came over the intercom, cutting through the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing for takeoff. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened, and your seat backs are in the upright position." The moment was suspended in time. Maya turned her attention to the seatbelt in front of her, doing exactly what she had already done moments before, ignoring Captain Jensen's presence entirely. She could feel his eyes on her, still lingering, but she refused to acknowledge him further. She had made her point, and now it was time for him to process it. The passengers around them had quieted, sensing the shift in energy but unsure of what had transpired. What had seemed like a simple, everyday interaction was quickly becoming something much more. But before Maya could settle into her seat, a sudden interruption jolted her out of her thoughts. The flight attendants began their final checks, and it seemed like the tension had momentarily shifted to routine. Yet, in the background, something was building, a quiet storm that would soon make itself known in ways no one expected. Captain Jensen's reaction wasn't over. Maya could feel it. The questions still lingered, and she knew something would give before this flight was over. What exactly was Captain Jensen planning? How far would he go to salvage his ego? Would the conflict between them escalate in ways no one could foresee? The answers to those questions were waiting just beneath the surface. And soon, everyone would see how it all unfolded. As the plane climbed into the sky, the hum of the engines filled the cabin, drowning out the murmur of whispers that had begun to ripple through the rows of seats. Maya sat quietly, her fingers drumming on the armrest, trying to steady her thoughts. She wasn't looking for a fight, not really. But sometimes, the smallest comments, the most insignificant moments, could tap into something much bigger. It wasn't just about the pilot's misplaced lecture, it was about the weight of years of being underestimated, of people who believed they could impose their views without consequence. Captain Jensen sat across the aisle, visibly tense. He wasn't used to feeling this way. He had spent his career flying high above the clouds, both literally and figuratively, with a sense of entitlement that came from years of experience. To him, the world was simple. He had the knowledge, the power, the title, he was the one people turned to for guidance. That's how it had always been, and that's how he believed it should always be. But Maya's response, her refusal to be silenced, left him rattled in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had expected her to shrink back, maybe apologize, even if it was just to get him off her case. But she didn't. Instead, she stood her ground, and that left him grappling with something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't just that she'd challenged him, it was that he'd been challenged in a way he hadn't been in years. In a way that made him question not just the situation, but himself. But Captain Jensen wasn't about to back down. The longer he stewed on it, the more his irritation simmered. He was a professional, after all. He was used to taking control of situations, and this was no different. He couldn't let a passenger, especially one who had so boldly questioned him, get away with making him look weak. And yet, deep down, he felt a gnawing discomfort. Was he really in the right? He glanced over at Maya again, but she had her eyes fixed on the seat in front of her, deliberately ignoring him. His frustration mounted. There was something about the way she carried herself, the calm confidence with which she responded, that made him feel small. And for someone who had spent his entire life in positions of power and authority, that feeling was foreign and uncomfortable. In the back of the plane, passengers continued to settle into the rhythm of the flight. For some, this was just another trip. For others, like Maya, it was more than that. She had traveled countless times before, but there was something different about this flight. Something had shifted. A small confrontation had unlocked a series of thoughts and feelings that she couldn't shake. She had worked hard to get to where she was, fighting for respect, for equal treatment, for recognition in spaces that were often hostile to people like her. But there was always that nagging voice, the one that told her she had to prove herself again and again. She had seen it in the eyes of colleagues, in the way her work was sometimes dismissed or overlooked, even though she had been a leader in her field. And she had seen it in the way she was treated in public spaces, where her intelligence, her presence, and her voice were often questioned or disregarded. It was these microaggressions, the little everyday indignities, that added up over time. And this pilot, with his misplaced arrogance, had just been the tipping point. Maya's mind raced as she stared at the seatbelt in front of her. She thought about the time she had let things slide, the time she had been forced to swallow her frustration, her anger, because it was easier than confronting it. But this was different. This wasn't just some random stranger on the street or an offhand comment from a coworker. This was someone in a position of power, someone who thought his authority allowed him to disrespect her. She wasn't going to let it slide this time. In the cockpit, Captain Jensen was fighting a battle of his own. He gripped the controls with white-knuckled tension, his thoughts swirling. The sky outside was a calm blue, the clouds drifting lazily beneath them, but inside the cockpit, the air was thick with unease. His co-pilot, a younger man named Daniel, sensed the shift. Daniel had been flying with Jensen for a few months now, and he had never seen his captain quite like this. Jensen was usually calm, collected, the picture of professional detachment. But now, something was off. "Everything all right, Captain?" Daniel asked, glancing over at his colleague. Jensen's jaw tightened. "Yeah, just a little off today." Daniel hesitated for a moment. He knew not to push Jensen too hard, but there was something in his tone that made him uneasy. "You sure?" "You've been a little," he paused, looking for the right word, distracted. Jensen's eyes flicked to Daniel for a split second, a brief flash of annoyance crossing his face. But he quickly masked it, clearing his throat and turning his attention back to the controls. "It's nothing," he muttered. "Let's just focus on the flight." Daniel didn't press the issue, but he couldn't help but feel that there was more going on. Jensen wasn't one to show cracks in his armor, but the tension in his voice, the way his hands trembled slightly on the controls, something was definitely bothering him. Back in the cabin, Maya's thoughts began to spiral as well. The longer she sat there, the more she found herself questioning everything about her decision to speak up. She wasn't second-guessing her words, she knew she had done the right thing. But the aftermath, the uncertainty, the potential fallout, it all weighed on her. What if Captain Jensen decided to make her life more difficult because of this? What if he reported her to the airline, painting her as a troublemaker? What if this moment, this small act of defiance, led to something much bigger and far more complicated than she was ready for? Maya's fingers tightened around the armrest. She had been in situations before where standing up for herself had cost her, where challenging authority had led to consequences she hadn't anticipated. But this felt different. This felt like it had the potential to escalate in ways that would make everything she had worked for feel fragile. It wasn't just about a power struggle between her and the pilot. It was about how the world saw her. How people like her were often forced to navigate these difficult dynamics, balancing between staying quiet to keep the peace or risking everything by asserting their own voice. And just as the tension between Maya and Captain Jensen simmered, another layer to the story began to unfold. A flight attendant, Sarah, was quietly observing the interaction from a distance. Sarah had been in the airline industry for over a decade, and she had seen her fair share of drama in the skies. But something about this situation felt different. She had noticed the way Captain Jensen had approached Maya, The way his tone had shifted from polite to condescending in a heartbeat. She had seen passengers treated unfairly before, but this felt more deliberate. And it bothered her. As Sarah made her way down the aisle, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to erupt. She didn't know how, but she knew that this flight was going to be one for the books. What started as a small altercation had the potential to ripple through the entire crew, to shift the dynamics of the flight in ways that no one could predict. And Sarah couldn't help but wonder, how far would Captain Jensen go to save face? And would Maya's decision to speak up change everything, not just for her, but for everyone on board? The stakes were rising. The plane was climbing higher into the sky, and so was the tension in the cabin. The cabin was growing quieter as the flight reached cruising altitude, but the underlying tension felt like it was hanging just above everyone's heads. Passengers stared out of windows or fiddled with the entertainment system, yet there was a nervous energy in the air. Maya couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to boil over. Her mind kept racing through the potential consequences of what had happened, what she had said to Captain Jensen. She didn't regret it, not for a second, but the unease in her gut told her that she wasn't out of the woods yet. As the flight continued, she became acutely aware of the space around her, the subtle glances from other passengers, the way their eyes would flicker toward her, then quickly turn away. They were witnessing a small battle, one that most people would rather ignore. Maya had grown used to being the subject of quiet judgment, to being the one who had to absorb stares or questions that others didn't face. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't just an ordinary passenger encounter. This time, it was a confrontation with someone who held power, someone who had the means to make things more difficult if he chose to. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last. She glanced over at Captain Jensen, who was still sitting in the cockpit, the thin partition between them offering no real separation. She could feel his eyes on her, even though he hadn't looked in her direction for some time. But the sense of hostility in the air was palpable, and she knew that whatever came next would be the moment that defined the rest of this flight. In the cockpit, Jensen was on edge. His hands gripped the controls tighter than usual, and his jaw clenched as he tried to focus on the flight path. But the image of Maya, the calm confidence in her eyes, her refusal to back down, kept invading his thoughts. It was as if she had punctured a hole in his armor, and now, no matter how hard he tried to focus, it wouldn't heal. He had spent years in the air, in control of his surroundings, the crew, and the passengers. But here, now, he felt something unfamiliar, doubt. His co-pilot, Daniel, could sense the shift. He had been in the business long enough to read people, to understand when something was off. Jensen's usual cool demeanor was slipping, and Daniel wasn't sure what to make of it. "Captain, do you need anything?" he asked tentatively, unsure if he was crossing a line. Jensen didn't respond immediately, his eyes flicking back to the flight instruments. "No," he muttered finally. "I'm fine." But Daniel wasn't convinced. He had heard the tension in the cabin earlier, the sharp exchange between Jensen and the woman, Maya. He had seen how it had affected the pilot, and now, he could sense the storm brewing. "You know, Captain," Daniel said, trying to break the silence, "sometimes it's better to let things go. No need to hold on to it." Jensen turned sharply, his face tight. "I'm not holding on to anything," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to make Daniel flinch. The words hung in the air, but neither man spoke again. The tension in the cockpit was thick, neither of them sure how to navigate it. Back in the cabin, Maya was still locked in her thoughts. Her mind flashed back to the moment when Jensen had first leaned over to lecture her. She had seen men like him before, the kind who thought their position, their title, gave them the right to impose their will. But she had learned early on that standing up for yourself wasn't just about defending your own dignity, it was about sending a message. She wasn't some passive bystander waiting for people to offer her respect. She had earned it, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. The minutes crawled by as the flight continued its journey, but the atmosphere on board had shifted. The casual hum of the aircraft seemed almost deafening now, the sound of the engines too loud in the silence that hung between Maya and Captain Jensen. Everyone could feel it, but no one dared to speak it aloud. The tension was building, steadily and relentlessly, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. Maya sat back in her seat, her fingers gripping the armrest again, but this time with a new sense of resolve. She knew she had made the right choice by speaking up, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play here than just the words exchanged between her and Jensen. She wasn't just fighting to assert her dignity in that moment. This was bigger. This was about the way people like her had been silenced for so long, about the systems of power that allowed individuals like Captain Jensen to feel entitled to speak down to others without consequence. And yet, something gnawed at her. What if Jensen had been right? What if the situation escalated beyond words? What if the airline took his side, because, after all, he was the captain? What if this small confrontation led to something bigger, something that could affect her future? She had worked too hard for too long to let this slip into a battle of egos. But the problem was, she could feel Jensen's ego clashing with hers, and she wasn't sure how much longer it could be contained. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps approaching broke her out of her thoughts. She looked up, her heart skipping a beat as she saw Sarah, the flight attendant, walking toward her. Sarah's expression was neutral, but Maya could tell something was different. The way she carried herself, the slight tension in her posture, suggested she knew more than she was letting on. "Is everything okay, ma'am?" Sarah asked, her voice calm but with an underlying concern. Maya hesitated, searching Sarah's face for any clue as to what was really going on. "Everything's fine," Maya replied, keeping her voice steady. But Sarah wasn't fooled. She had seen too much in her years working with passengers and crew to ignore the signs. "I know there was some tension earlier between you and the captain," Sarah said quietly, lowering her voice so only Maya could hear. "If you need anything, if there's any way I can help, just let me know." Maya was taken aback for a moment. She wasn't sure what to make of Sarah's sudden interest in her well-being. But something in her gut told her that this wasn't just idle conversation. Sarah had witnessed the exchange between her and Captain Jensen, and now, she was offering a lifeline, though Maya wasn't sure whether it was an offer of protection or an unspoken warning. Before Maya could respond, a loud voice rang out from the cockpit, a sharp, commanding tone that carried through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. We are preparing for a sudden change in course." The announcement made Maya's heart race. The flight, which had already felt like an emotional roller coaster, was about to take another turn. And this time, she wasn't sure what that change would mean, for her, for Captain Jensen, or for everyone on board. The tension was rising to an unbearable pitch. Something was about to happen, something neither Maya nor Captain Jensen could control, and the consequences of this moment would echo far beyond the flight. Every passenger could feel it now, the pulse of uncertainty, the knowledge that the calm before the storm had passed. The climax was coming. And no one was ready for it. The sudden change in course caught everyone off guard. The plane's engines hummed louder, and the gentle rocking that had once felt like a natural part of the flight became more pronounced. Passengers around Maya looked around in confusion, their eyes darting nervously. Flight attendants scrambled down the aisles, reassuring passengers with calm words, but there was an unspoken tension that now hung in the air. Maya's heart raced, but it wasn't just because of the unexpected change in altitude, it was because of the growing sense that something wasn't right. She glanced up at Sarah, who was still standing beside her seat, her expression unreadable. Sarah's eyes flicked toward the cockpit before she quickly turned her attention back to Maya. "Stay calm," Sarah said softly, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of worry. "We're just going through a routine adjustment. Nothing to worry about." But even as she spoke the words, her eyes betrayed her, flickering with doubt. Maya nodded, though her mind was spinning. What was really going on? The announcement over the intercom had been vague, and the pilot's sudden maneuver felt anything but routine. She could feel the atmosphere in the cabin change, like the collective breath of the passengers had been held in anticipation. It wasn't just the turbulence that unnerved them, it was the sense of impending danger, something that couldn't be seen but was undeniably felt. Seconds stretched into minutes as the plane veered through the sky, and then it happened. A loud, unexpected jolt rattled the aircraft, far more intense than anything Maya had experienced on a flight before. The overhead bins rattled, and a few passengers gasped in alarm. It wasn't just turbulence anymore. This felt like something more. Maya's stomach flipped as the plane tilted in a way that wasn't quite natural. The passengers around her were murmuring now, some clutching their armrests, others holding onto each other. Then came another sharp jolt, and for a split second, the cabin was filled with a terrifying sense of weightlessness before gravity took hold again. Maya's breath caught in her throat, and instinctively, she reached out, gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles went white. "What's going on?" a voice near the front of the cabin shouted, panic rising in the tone. "Are we crashing?" Sarah's eyes locked with Maya's for a brief moment, and in that fleeting exchange, Maya saw the flicker of something she hadn't expected, a flash of fear. Sarah quickly straightened, forcing a reassuring smile on her face as she moved down the aisle to calm the other passengers. But Maya was left with the unsettling feeling that things were rapidly spiraling out of control. In the cockpit, Captain Jensen was trying to steady his nerves. The plane's erratic movements weren't just a result of turbulence. He could feel something in the systems, a disturbance in the instruments that he couldn't explain. His hand hovered over the control panel, sweat beading on his forehead. His co-pilot, Daniel, was silent beside him, his eyes flicking nervously between the readings and Jensen's increasingly frantic movements. "Captain, we need to check the instruments," Daniel said, his voice low but urgent. "Something's off." Jensen didn't answer immediately, his focus split between the instruments and the communication system. He tried to push down the rising panic in his chest, but it wasn't working. He was trained for emergencies, for handling situations in which things went wrong. But this felt different. The plane's readings were fluctuating wildly, and the usual systems that could predict and rectify turbulence were now showing anomalies. A cold knot formed in Jensen's stomach as he glanced at the monitor. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. "We need to inform the passengers," Daniel urged, but Jensen was already reaching for the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain calm." Jensen's voice crackled through the speakers, but it was strained, almost hoarse. "We are experiencing some unexpected system irregularities. Please stay seated and follow the instructions of the crew." Maya's heart pounded as she heard the captain's announcement. "Unexpected system irregularities," she whispered under her breath. That didn't sound like a routine malfunction. That didn't sound like something that would be over in a few minutes. She glanced around, and for the first time, she noticed the fear in the eyes of the other passengers. The flight attendants were moving faster now, but they didn't look like they were in control of the situation. They were reacting, not leading. Panic was beginning to creep through the cabin. And then, just when Maya thought things couldn't escalate any further, another announcement came over the intercom, but this time it wasn't from the captain. It was a voice she didn't recognize, calm but unmistakably urgent. "This is First Officer Walker. I need to inform all passengers that the situation on board is more serious than previously indicated. We are currently experiencing technical difficulties that may compromise the safety of this flight." Please stay in your seats and remain calm. Further instructions will follow shortly. Maya's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a malfunction. It wasn't just turbulence. Something was happening, something far worse, and no one was explaining what it was. The tone of the first officer's voice wasn't just professional, it was filled with an underlying tension that made Maya's stomach churn. The passengers were starting to panic. Some began to pray, others were clutching their phones, trying to send messages or make calls. A few were whispering frantically about what they had heard. Maya's mind raced as she tried to piece together what little she knew. It felt like a nightmare, the kind where you were screaming but no sound came out, trapped in a situation you couldn't control. And then, in the midst of the chaos, Sarah returned to Maya's seat. Her face was pale, and her voice was low, barely above a whisper. "There's more going on here than they're telling us," she said urgently. "You need to stay calm, but there's something happening behind the scenes. They're not telling us everything." Maya's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What's going on?" Sarah hesitated for a long moment before leaning in closer. "I don't know exactly, but it seems like they've lost control of more than just the plane's instruments. They've been having issues with communication, with the flight control systems, for the past hour. And now they're trying to keep it quiet." She paused, her eyes flicking toward the cockpit as if she was weighing how much more to reveal. "I think they're hoping no one will notice. But we're too far in the air, and there's no easy way out of this." Maya's mind spun. The captain's erratic behavior, the malfunctioning instruments, the mysterious voice of the first officer, it was all beginning to add up to something far more dangerous than a simple mechanical issue. The stakes were much higher than anyone had anticipated. The tension in the cabin was suffocating now. People were beginning to shout, asking for answers, but no one could give them. As Maya looked around the cabin, she realized that whatever was about to happen next was something none of them could prepare for. And in that moment, the only thing that was clear was that nothing, absolutely nothing, would be the same after this flight. The chaos in the cabin was escalating rapidly. The murmur of anxious voices grew louder, and panic was setting in. Maya's hands were clammy as she gripped the armrests of her seat, her mind racing. The crew had become visibly strained, trying to maintain some semblance of order, but it was clear that they were as much in the dark as the passengers. The seconds dragged on, stretching the already unbearable tension to its breaking point. Maya's thoughts were a whirlwind. Sarah's warning echoed in her ears, something was wrong, something was being kept from them. She looked around at the panicked faces of her fellow passengers, some praying, some clutching their loved ones, others too terrified to speak. She couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was spiraling out of control. Whatever was happening behind the scenes, it wasn't just a malfunction. It was something bigger, and the sense of dread was spreading faster than the turbulence. The overhead bins rattled again, this time more violently than before. The plane bucked beneath them, a sudden downward shift sending everyone's stomachs lurching as the passengers screamed in unison. Maya's breath hitched. The fear in the air was palpable, but amidst the chaos, something else caught her attention. Sarah's hand, gripping the back of a seat in front of her, trembled slightly as she glanced toward the cockpit once more. Her gaze was full of unease, her lips pressed tightly together. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life, but this time it wasn't the familiar voice of Captain Jensen. Instead, the voice was cold, distant, and unsettling. "This is First Officer Walker. I need everyone to remain seated and fasten their seatbelts. We are currently experiencing technical failures beyond our control. Do not attempt to leave your seats until further notice. I repeat, remain in your seats." The sudden authority in the voice, paired with the chilling implications of the message, sent a shockwave of fear through the cabin. The first officer's words left a sour taste in the air. Maya could feel the panic building, like a pressure cooker about to explode. But there was something else beneath the surface, something that didn't add up. "Sarah, what aren't they telling us?" Maya whispered, leaning closer to the flight attendant. Sarah looked around nervously, her face tight with suppressed fear. "They can't land. The systems, they're failing. They've lost communication with air traffic control. They're trying to fix it, but..." Sarah's voice trailed off. Her eyes flickered to the cockpit once more before she turned to Maya. "You need to understand, the captain, he knows something we don't. He's been acting strange, distracted, agitated. And now this." She motioned around the cabin, where people were beginning to shout, demand answers. Maya's pulse raced as her mind began to piece together the puzzle. The captain's odd behavior, the malfunctioning instruments, and now the cryptic warnings. It wasn't just an ordinary failure, it was as if they were being steered towards something far worse. She didn't know how or why, but the more she thought about it, the more it felt like the crew wasn't fully in control. The announcement cut off abruptly, and the plane jolted again, more violently this time. The entire aircraft seemed to shudder in protest, the lights flickering. Then, as suddenly as it began, the turbulence ceased. The silence that followed felt heavy, almost suffocating. Maya's heart hammered in her chest. What had just happened? Before she could gather her thoughts, the door to the cockpit swung open, and Captain Jensen stepped out. His face was pale, his eyes wide with barely contained fear. He quickly moved down the aisle, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. A hush fell over the cabin as passengers instinctively turned to look at him. He glanced at the crowd, his mouth moving as if he were about to speak, but no words came out. Then, something unexpected happened. A figure in a uniform, not one of the flight attendants, but a man in a plain suit, someone Maya hadn't noticed before, emerged from behind the curtain separating the cabin from the crew area. The man moved swiftly, almost too quickly, his eyes locked on Jensen. There was a moment of eerie silence as the two men stared at each other. The suited man spoke first, his voice low but firm. "You need to tell them, Captain." Jensen froze. For the briefest of moments, he seemed unsure of how to respond. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Not yet," he muttered, his voice strained. "It's not time." The suited man stepped closer, his tone no longer patient. "It's already happening. We've lost control. We need to act now." Maya, sitting in her seat, could feel the weight of the moment, the tension in the air thickening with each passing second. She was trying to piece together what was going on, what this stranger had to do with the situation. Who was he? What was happening? And then, as if on cue, the man turned sharply and headed toward the rear of the cabin, disappearing into the staff area. Captain Jensen, now visibly shaken, stood still for a moment, his eyes flicking toward the cockpit. "Something's wrong," Jensen finally said, his voice cracked. "There's been an emergency, a critical malfunction." Maya's mind raced, but before she could respond, the intercom crackled once more, this time with a clearer message. "This is First Officer Walker. We are declaring an emergency flight path diversion. We are rerouting to an alternate destination. Please remain in your seats and prepare for an unanticipated landing. Further details will be provided shortly." Maya's blood ran cold. The flight had been hijacked. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The systems had failed, but it wasn't just a malfunction, it was orchestrated. Someone had planned this. But who? And why? And what was this sudden diversion all about? Everything she had experienced during this flight, Jensen's strange behavior, the first officer's cryptic announcements, the sudden interference from the mysterious man in the suit, it all pointed toward one terrifying possibility: they weren't just in the air. They were being controlled by someone, someone with an agenda far beyond just a technical failure. This wasn't just a case of incompetence or bad luck, it was deliberate. Just as Maya sat there, grappling with the shock of the realization, a soft voice behind her caught her attention. Sarah, standing there, her eyes wide with fear, leaned in. "It's happening. The hijackers, they're not who we thought they were. They're connected to something much bigger." And then, as the final, devastating twist unfolded, Captain Jensen's voice came through the intercom again, but this time it wasn't just a voice of concern. It was a warning. A warning that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice grim, "prepare for impact." Maya's breath hitched. The stakes had just reached a terrifying new height. This flight, which had started as an ordinary journey, had now become a high-stakes battle for survival. And as the plane descended toward an uncertain fate, the passengers were left to wonder who, if anyone, would make it out alive. The plane's descent was rapid, too rapid for comfort, and the sharp, sudden lurch of the aircraft sent Maya's heart into overdrive. Panic surged through her as she tightened her grip on the armrest, staring wide-eyed at the rows of passengers around her. Some were holding hands, others whispering silent prayers, but most were simply frozen, paralyzed by the uncertain fate that awaited them. The sound of the engines strained against the pressure, the vibrations rattling through the cabin like an unstoppable force. Sarah appeared at Maya's side again, her face pale but composed. "Stay calm, we're not out of this yet," she said, her voice a fragile thread of reassurance. Her words seemed to hang in the air, as though neither of them believed them to be entirely true. In the front of the cabin, Captain Jensen had disappeared into the cockpit once again, his earlier expressions of distress now fully replaced by a stoic silence. The intercom had fallen silent as well, leaving only the muffled sound of wind and the strained hum of the plane's engines to fill the air. No one spoke. The fear was suffocating, palpable, and despite the efforts of the flight crew to maintain order, the feeling of impending doom was unavoidable. Suddenly, the lights flickered once more, casting brief shadows across the passengers' faces, intensifying the already tense atmosphere. Maya's mind raced. What had happened to the hijackers? Why had they taken control? And who are they really? For all the chaos and uncertainty, one thing was crystal clear: this wasn't a random event. Someone had been orchestrating the entire thing, pulling strings behind the scenes. The thought gnawed at her. But just as that thought started to consume her, the plane pitched downward again with a gut-wrenching jolt. The cabin filled with shouts of alarm, and the floor beneath her feet felt unstable, as though the plane had lost its battle against the atmosphere itself. Maya's stomach lurched, and she had to steady herself to keep from panicking. Her thoughts spun wildly. This was it. This was the moment everything could go wrong. But then, something remarkable happened. Without warning, the shaking stopped. The sudden calm was disorienting, as though the universe itself had decided to take a breath. Maya's heart hammered in her chest as she slowly, cautiously, unbuckled her seatbelt. The soft hum of the engines seemed almost peaceful now, if it weren't for the still-churning anxiety in her gut. She glanced around, looking for answers, but all she saw were confused faces, eyes wide with uncertainty. Then, the voice of Captain Jensen crackled through the intercom once more, and this time, his tone was steady, though there was still an edge to it. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I want to assure you that the emergency has been resolved. We have neutralized the threat and regained full control of the aircraft. The situation is under control, and we will be landing shortly. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened until further notice." The weight of the words hung heavily in the air, and Maya could barely process them. The hijackers had been neutralized? But how? And who had done it? There were so many unanswered questions, and yet, there was a strange sense of relief that washed over her. She wasn't sure if she felt safe, but at least the immediate danger seemed to be over. As the plane slowly leveled out, the turbulence finally gave way to a smoother flight. The passengers, still in shock, began to exhale, slowly coming to grips with the fact that they had narrowly escaped a catastrophe. Some looked around, as if searching for answers in each other's eyes. Others buried their faces in their hands, too overwhelmed by emotion to speak. Sarah, her face still pale but showing signs of relief, returned to her duties as a flight attendant. She moved briskly down the aisle, offering calm words of reassurance to the passengers who had begun to speak in hushed tones. Maya, still shaken, couldn't help but wonder how the crew had managed to regain control so quickly. She glanced at Sarah, her eyes full of questions. As if reading her mind, Sarah leaned in. It wasn't the crew, Maya. The man in the suit, he was part of the team that handled the situation. He's part of an organization that tracks down threats like this before they escalate. He's been trained for situations like this. Maya's eyes widened in disbelief. An organization? But, what kind of organization? Sarah hesitated for a moment, casting a wary glance toward the cockpit before speaking again. I can't say too much. But let's just say they're tasked with making sure things like this don't get out of hand. They deal with high-stakes emergencies, ones that the public never hears about. And the hijackers? They weren't random. They were part of a larger operation, something much bigger than we realized. But that's all I can tell you. Maya's mind reeled as she processed the revelation. An entire covert organization? And these hijackers, what had they been after? Who are they really? But no answers came, only more questions, as the flight continued toward its mysterious destination. As the plane descended, the lights in the cabin flickered again, signaling that they were approaching their landing. Passengers glanced out the windows nervously, trying to catch a glimpse of the ground below. What kind of airport were they headed for? Where were they landing? Finally, the plane touched down with a smooth, controlled landing that sent a wave of relief through the cabin. The engines whined as they slowed to a halt, and the tension in the air seemed to dissipate, at least for the moment. Maya looked out the window as the plane taxied toward the gate. The airport below was unlike any she had ever seen. It was small, quiet, and almost eerily isolated. A sense of secrecy hung in the air, but she couldn't put her finger on why. The crew began to prepare the cabin for disembarkation, and passengers slowly started to gather their belongings. Maya sat in her seat, her mind racing with all the information she had just received. The hijacking, the organization, the covert operation, everything had happened so quickly, and yet the questions lingered, unanswered. As she stood to exit the plane, Sarah approached her one last time. Don't mention what you've seen or heard here. It's better that way. For everyone's sake. Maya nodded, understanding the weight of Sarah's words. Whatever had happened on this flight, whatever had been uncovered, was meant to stay hidden. With a final glance at Sarah, Maya stepped off the plane, her heart still pounding in her chest. She didn't know what had just happened, but she knew one thing for sure: this flight had changed her forever. As the doors of the terminal opened, and the cool air hit her face, Maya took a deep breath, knowing that some stories were never meant to be told. Some mysteries were meant to stay buried. And as she disappeared into the unknown, the story of the hijacked flight, of the flight etiquette lecture, the unthinkable turn of events, and the shadowy organizations working behind the scenes, would remain a secret. For now. The tension in the air was thick, palpable, as a young black woman sat nervously in her seat at the gate, watching people around her board the plane. She had been excited about this trip for weeks, her first solo flight, a long-awaited journey to visit family in another city. But as she sat there, something felt off. Something was wrong, and she couldn't quite place it. A flight attendant approached her with a smile, but the words that followed felt like a slap to her face. "You need to leave the plane," the attendant said, her tone cold, dismissive. "You're not allowed to fly today." Confusion quickly turned to disbelief. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had followed all the rules, checked in on time, boarded with everyone else, and was now being told to leave without any clear explanation. Her heart raced as whispers from nearby passengers filled the cabin. Some were silent, some exchanged glances, and others seemed to watch with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. She tried to protest, but the attendant was unyielding. "It's not up for discussion," she said, her words firm, leaving no room for negotiation. As the young woman walked off the plane, a deep sense of injustice washed over her. How could this be happening? Was it because of the color of her skin? Was she being unfairly targeted? The thought haunted her as she stood outside, watching the plane pull away from the gate without her. But what happened next would leave everyone, passengers, airline staff, and even the flight attendants, shocked to their core. Just 7 minutes later, the scene took a turn that no one saw coming. As the young woman walked back into the airport terminal, a sudden realization struck her. It wasn't just about being kicked off a plane, it was about something bigger. Something that would turn the tables and leave the airline forever changed. With one bold move, she was about to make an unprecedented decision, one that would flip the entire situation on its head. But the question that everyone was asking, how could this happen? How could a woman who was wronged just moments ago now stand at the forefront of an airline, holding the power that everyone had denied her? Was it really possible? What did she have up her sleeve, and how would this incredible turn of events unfold? Stay tuned, because what you're about to hear next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, privilege, and justice in the skies. The young woman stood in the airport lobby, seething with a mixture of anger and disbelief. She had just been kicked off a plane for reasons that made no sense to her. The humiliation, the injustice, everything about the situation felt like a slap in the face. She couldn't understand why this was happening. She had done everything right. She followed the rules. So why was she being treated like this? She was just one person, alone against a system that seemed to have no regard for her. But in that moment, something shifted inside her. The fire inside her grew stronger, and she wasn't about to let this slide. She took a deep breath, wiped away the few tears that had started to gather in her eyes, and made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't just going to walk away defeated. No, she was going to fight back. And not in the way most people would expect. She wasn't going to scream or shout at the airline staff or try to argue with the gate agents. That wasn't her style. Instead, she had a bigger plan. In a world where the rich and powerful often seemed untouchable, she realized she could make a statement much more powerful than any angry confrontation. She didn't need to fight the system on its terms. She could beat them at their own game. And what she was about to do would leave everyone, especially those who thought they had power over her, staring in disbelief. Minutes later, as she stood at the terminal's information desk, she began to take the first steps of an unexpected journey. She had no intention of going home, not without getting some answers and taking control of the situation. What she was about to do would show everyone that sometimes the most powerful force is not raw anger, but strategic action and a relentless drive to change the game. As she typed away on her phone, making a few quick calls, her mind raced with possibilities. The airline that had just thrown her off, she would take it down, not with fists, but with her mind, her grit, and a move that no one saw coming. What would seem like a simple act of defiance would soon lead to something so much larger than anyone expected. But here's the catch: while she was setting the wheels of her plan into motion, the people who wronged her were blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to hit. The flight attendants, the airline executives, and even the passengers who watched her walk off the plane, none of them had any idea what kind of storm she was about to unleash. They had underestimated her, written her off as just another passenger. Big mistake. The world was about to witness a dramatic shift in power, one that would not only change the trajectory of her life but also make a statement about the way society treats people, particularly black women, in everyday situations. This was no longer just about one woman being unfairly kicked off a plane, it was about showing the world that sometimes, the people who are wronged are the ones who come out on top. And the question that lingered in the air now, could one person really take down a giant like an airline? Could she, the young woman no one thought twice about, actually own the airline and turn the tables? You won't believe what happens next, but trust me, this story isn't over yet. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into how one incredible woman went from being the victim of discrimination to owning the very system that tried to break her. What seemed impossible was only the beginning. And when the next part of the story unfolds, you'll realize that sometimes, the greatest power lies in the most unexpected hands. The young woman stood in the bustling airport terminal, the sounds of distant announcements and rushing footsteps fading into the background as her mind raced. She could feel the sting of injustice still burning inside her, and yet there was a calm resolve settling over her. She wasn't just any passenger who'd been kicked off a plane, this was something bigger. She was about to rewrite the narrative in ways no one would have imagined. Her name was Maya, a 24-year-old recent college graduate, ambitious and determined, but most of all, tired. Tired of the discrimination she faced daily, tired of the subtle and not-so-subtle racism that had followed her throughout her life. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. Not just to prove a point, but to change the course of her future, and maybe even the future of others who had been pushed aside by systems that didn't care. Maya had grown up in a neighborhood where people of color were often overlooked, where opportunities seemed to vanish the moment they appeared. She had been the girl who worked twice as hard to get half the recognition, the one who was constantly reminded that the world wasn't designed for her. It wasn't just about overt racism, it was in the small slights, the passing comments, the missed opportunities. She had learned to navigate life with resilience, but today, she realized something. This time, it wasn't just about surviving the system. It was about taking control of it. As Maya stood there, gathering her thoughts, she recalled the events of the last hour. The flight attendant, a woman in her mid-40s with a stern expression and a sharp tone, had called her aside when she was boarding, telling her she needed to leave the plane. At first, Maya thought it was a mistake. She'd checked in early, she had her ticket, and there was no reason for her to be singled out. But the attendant's insistence was unwavering. "We don't want any trouble," the woman had said. "Just go back to the gate." When Maya asked for a reason, the response had been vague. "It's just policy." She had tried to stay calm, to reason with her. But the attendant had already made up her mind. The passengers who had seen it happen whispered among themselves, some in disbelief, others in quiet judgment. A few passengers shot Maya sympathetic looks, but no one spoke up. No one did anything. And that's when it hit her. It wasn't just that she'd been kicked off a plane. It was the fact that no one cared enough to stop it. The passengers, the gate agents, the attendants, they all allowed it to happen, either by ignorance or indifference. Maya wasn't just angry about being unfairly treated. She was furious because this kind of behavior was allowed to continue. She realized then that she wasn't the only one who'd ever been mistreated in such a manner. The difference was that now, she had a choice, to let it go or to change everything. Maya's thoughts turned to her childhood. She had grown up listening to stories of people who had fought against systems of oppression, heroes in her eyes, the ones who had defied the odds and made history. She had always admired them, but she never imagined she would be in the position to do something similar. But now, it was as though the universe had placed her in this very moment for a reason. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her back into the present. It was a text message from her older brother, Malik. She smiled softly. Malik had always been her rock, the one person who encouraged her to keep pushing forward, no matter the obstacles. His message was simple, but it gave her the clarity she needed. This is your moment. Don't let them define you. That was all Maya needed to hear. She had a choice. She could walk away, let the injustice slide, and just get on with her life. But no, that was never who she was. She wasn't about to let this go. She wasn't about to let this airline or anyone else decide what she was worth. And if she had to fight, really fight, for her voice to be heard, then so be it. Maya knew this wasn't going to be easy. She didn't have a direct path to victory, and the odds were stacked against her. But she also understood one thing: people underestimated her. They saw her as just another passenger, someone who was easy to push around. What they didn't know was that Maya was smart, determined, and ready to make a move. Without wasting any more time, Maya stepped toward the nearest public phone and dialed a number she had found earlier. It belonged to an attorney who specialized in corporate cases, someone who had fought against large companies in the past and won. It wasn't a random decision. Maya had been doing research for the past few months. She had been watching and learning, building up her knowledge of legal loopholes, corporate strategies, and how big companies operated. The phone rang a few times before a voice on the other end picked up. "Hello?" Maya cleared her throat. "Hi, my name is Maya Jennings. I need your help with something. It's urgent." She could hear the attorney's interest peak on the other end. "What's going on?" "I was just removed from a flight by one of your airline's attendants. I was singled out for no reason, and I'm not the only one who has experienced something like this. I want to know what you can do about it." There was a pause, but it wasn't long before the attorney replied. "I can help. What airline are we talking about here?" Maya hesitated for just a moment before answering. "It's Crescent Airlines." The attorney's voice softened. "I know that airline. They have a reputation for handling complaints like this poorly. They're not exactly known for their customer service." Maya nodded, though the attorney couldn't see it. She had known that too. Crescent Airlines was a giant in the industry, a company that had expanded rapidly over the years, but it also had a history of complaints, ranging from customer service issues to more serious allegations of discrimination. She had read about it, but never in her wildest dreams did she think she would become a part of the story. "I need to act fast," Maya said. "This isn't just about me. It's about the people they've mistreated for years. I don't just want an apology. I want to take them down." The attorney was quiet for a long moment, and then she spoke slowly. "I think I can help you with that. But this won't be easy. You're going to need more than just an attorney. You'll need a team. And we'll need to hit them where it hurts." Maya's heart raced. This was it, the beginning of something much bigger than she could have ever imagined. She wasn't just fighting for her own rights anymore. She was about to take on an entire system. And she wasn't going to stop until she saw it fall. Maya hung up the phone, her pulse quickening. The words of the attorney echoed in her mind: "You'll need a team." For the first time since being removed from that plane, she felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't going to be a fight she took on alone. This was going to be bigger, much bigger, than one woman's anger over a single injustice. It was going to be a movement. And in that moment, Maya understood that she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every person who had ever been overlooked, mistreated, or silenced by systems of power. She had a plan now. But, as the attorney had said, this was going to be a fight, not a quick battle. Maya knew that taking down a giant like Crescent Airlines wouldn't be easy. She needed leverage, she needed allies, and most of all, she needed the right tools. Her mind raced as she thought about the next steps. First, she needed to gather evidence. There had to be more people who'd been wronged by the airline. She couldn't be the only one. She pulled out her phone again, scrolling through social media. Maya had seen countless posts over the years from people complaining about poor service, discrimination, and unfair treatment on Crescent Airlines. She had to find those stories, connect with those people, and use their experiences to build a case strong enough to make the airline take notice. She needed to show them that the issue wasn't just isolated to her, that there was a pattern. And when it came to evidence, she knew she could use her own experience as a starting point. She documented everything, from the moment she was told to leave the plane to her interactions with the flight attendants and the gate agents. She had receipts, names, times, and even witness accounts. Maya's mind was racing now, planning out every step. She quickly jotted down a list of tasks in her phone, gather witness testimonies, secure legal representation, research the airline's history of complaints. She had to be strategic. This wasn't going to be some spontaneous campaign, it was going to be well thought out, calculated, and methodical. Every move had to count. It was already late in the afternoon, but Maya knew she couldn't waste any time. Her thoughts turned to her best friend, Kira, a tech-savvy, no-nonsense woman who had helped her with everything from research projects to personal issues. Kira was the kind of person who always had a solution to any problem. Maya needed her now more than ever. She sent Kira a quick message, "I need your help. Can you meet me at the coffee shop in 30 minutes?" Kira's reply came almost immediately, "On my way." 30 minutes later, Maya sat at a corner table, her mind still racing, as Kira walked in. Kira was wearing her usual black hoodie and leggings, looking effortlessly cool. She slid into the seat across from Maya and gave her a curious look. "What's going on? You look like you're about to launch a crusade," Kira said with a grin, but Maya could see the concern in her eyes. Maya didn't hesitate. I'm taking on Crescent Airlines." Kira blinked. "Wait, what? The airline that kicked you off the plane?" Maya nodded. "Yeah. But it's bigger than that. They've been doing this to people for years. I need your help to expose them." Kira leaned back in her seat, processing the information. She knew Maya was a fighter, but this was different. "All right, I'm listening. What do you need me to do?" Maya explained everything, the way she was removed from the plane, the lack of explanation, the dismissive attitude of the flight attendant. She told Kira about her plan to gather evidence, the people she needed to connect with, and the legal battle she was about to embark on. Kira's eyes widened with each new detail, but there was no hint of doubt in her expression. "I'm in," Kira said without hesitation. "What's first?" "I need you to help me dig deeper," Maya replied. "Find any news articles, complaints, anything about Crescent Airlines that might help me build a case. I also need you to help me set up an online platform, something where people can share their stories. If this airline is as bad as I think it is, we need to get a lot of voices on our side." Kira grinned. "I got you. Let's make this viral." With Kira on board, Maya's confidence grew. She was no longer just a woman alone in an airport, she was part of something larger. She was going to make this airline answer for what it had done, not just to her, but to countless others. She could already see the pieces falling into place. But even as she felt a surge of excitement, she also knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. There would be pushback, resistance. And Crescent Airlines would not go down without a fight. As the evening wore on, the two of them brainstormed ideas for how to gather more testimonies and spread the word. They spent hours setting up a website for people to anonymously share their experiences with Crescent Airlines. Kira worked her magic, crafting a sleek, user-friendly design that would allow anyone to submit their stories and evidence, while Maya focused on contacting people who had been affected. She reached out to former employees, ex-passengers, and even flight attendants who might have witnessed or experienced similar mistreatment. The more she heard, the more her resolve hardened. This wasn't just about one bad experience on a plane. This was systemic. It wasn't just a couple of rogue flight attendants making poor decisions, this was a pattern of discrimination, of mistreatment. People of color, especially black women, had been treated unfairly time and time again. And now, she was determined to do something about it. By the end of the week, their website had received dozens of submissions. Stories poured in from across the country, stories of canceled flights, unexplained delays, rude staff, and worse. Some passengers claimed they had been told to leave their seats without reason, while others reported outright verbal abuse from staff members. It was clear that this was bigger than Maya had ever anticipated. But still, she wasn't satisfied. She knew there was more to uncover, more to expose. She wasn't going to rest until Crescent Airlines felt the weight of what it had done, and until the entire system that allowed this mistreatment to continue was shaken to its core. Maya wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been told they didn't matter. She was about to make sure the world knew their stories, and no amount of power, money, or corporate influence would keep their voices quiet. And as the days passed, Maya's resolve only strengthened. She was ready to take down Crescent Airlines, and she wasn't going to stop until she had what she needed to do it. Maya sat at her desk, the glow of her laptop screen casting shadows on her face as she read through the growing pile of stories on her website. Each new submission was another voice, another piece of evidence that this wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a systemic issue within Crescent Airlines. People from all walks of life, from different parts of the country, were sharing their painful experiences. She felt a surge of both anger and determination. She wasn't just fighting for her own justice anymore, she was fighting for the countless others who had been ignored or silenced for years. Her phone buzzed on the table, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Kira. "I found something. It's big." Maya's heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting for this. "What is it?" she quickly replied, already leaning forward in her seat, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Kira's reply came almost immediately. "I dug into their financials. There's a pattern of discrimination lawsuits they've quietly settled over the years. They bury it in their PR campaigns. They've been buying silence." Maya sat back, stunned for a moment. Crescent Airlines had managed to keep these cases under wraps. It was one thing to hear complaints from passengers, it was another to discover a hidden history of settlements designed to avoid public scrutiny. This was the breakthrough they needed. But it also made her uneasy. If the airline had been getting away with this for so long, how much more would they be willing to do to keep it quiet? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. It was Malik, her older brother. He had always been the first to support her, no matter how crazy her ideas seemed. His brow was furrowed, and he looked concerned. "Maya, you need to be careful," he said, his voice serious. "You're going after a giant. They have the resources to crush you." Maya met his gaze with determination. "I know. But I'm not backing down." Malik pulled up a chair and sat across from her, his expression softening. "Look, I get why you're doing this. I do. But there's a lot you don't know about how these companies work. If you keep pushing them, they'll come for you. They'll find a way to discredit you. You've got to be ready for that." Maya swallowed hard, but her resolve didn't waver. "I've already thought about that. I'm not going in blind. We've got something they can't ignore. I'm not just fighting them in the court of law, I'm fighting them in the court of public opinion. We're already making noise." Malik nodded slowly, but there was still a trace of worry in his eyes. "Just don't let them turn this around on you. They'll try to make you the villain if they can." As Malik left, his warning lingered in Maya's mind. She knew the stakes were high, but she also knew that the people who had suffered in silence for so long couldn't afford for her to back down now. She couldn't let Crescent Airlines silence them any longer. She wouldn't let their stories be buried. The next day, Maya and Kira sat in a small cafe, poring over the data they had gathered. Kira had managed to secure a few key documents that revealed an unsettling truth. Crescent Airlines had been operating with what could only be described as a culture of systemic bias. Employees had been encouraged to manage complaints without addressing the root causes, and there were multiple reports of unfair treatment, especially toward people of color. Maya's heart raced as she skimmed through the pages of settlements and non-disclosure agreements. This wasn't just about bad service, this was about a culture of discrimination that had been allowed to fester unchecked. "Okay, this is huge," Kira said, her eyes widening as she read through the documents. "This is more than just passenger complaints. This is a full-on cover-up." Maya nodded, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. "If we can expose this, if we can get this to the public," her words trailed off as she realized the weight of what they were about to do. It wasn't just about a single injustice anymore, they were about to take on a massive corporation, one that had been hiding its dark secrets for years. But Maya knew she couldn't do this alone. The stakes were too high. She needed more than just Kira's help. She needed a team of people who could take this to the next level, people who knew how to handle public relations, media exposure, and legal battles. She needed someone who understood how to navigate the corporate world without getting swallowed up by it. And then it hit her. There was one person she knew who could help. Ryan Mitchell, the investigative journalist who had broken several high-profile stories about corporate corruption. Ryan was known for his tenacity and his ability to dig deep into systems that most people were afraid to touch. He was someone Maya had admired from afar for years. If anyone could help her expose Crescent Airlines' dirty laundry, it was him. She didn't waste any time. She found Ryan's contact information online and shot him a message, explaining the situation briefly and asking for a meeting. She knew it was a long shot, but she also knew she had nothing to lose. Ryan had built his career by going after the biggest targets, and Maya's story was just the kind of thing he'd sink his teeth into. A few hours later, Maya was sitting across from Ryan at a quiet bar. He was older than she expected, mid-40s, with a sharp gaze and a demeanor that suggested he had seen it all. His reputation for getting to the heart of corporate malfeasance had earned him a lot of enemies, and Maya could sense the skepticism in his eyes as she laid out her case. "I've heard of Crescent Airlines," Ryan said, his voice low. "They've got a lot of skeletons in their closet, but they're also one of the biggest players in the industry. You really think you can take them down?" Maya met his gaze with a steady look. "I'm not just trying to take them down. I'm trying to expose everything they've been hiding for years. This isn't just about me, this is about everyone who's been mistreated by them. I can't do it alone, though. I need your help." Ryan studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right, I'm in. But this is going to get messy. There's no going back once we start digging." Maya's heart pounded in her chest. She had just secured the allies she needed. But even with Ryan's expertise, she knew they were up against a powerful opponent. Crescent Airlines had the resources to fight back, legally, financially, and through the media. Maya could already see the headlines: "Angry passenger starts campaign against major airline." They try to paint her as a disgruntled customer, an outlier who didn't represent the bigger picture. But Maya wasn't about to let them control the narrative. She was done being silenced, done being overlooked. She was going to expose Crescent Airlines for what they were, no matter the cost. As she left the bar with Ryan, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of something monumental. She had no idea how far this would go or where it would lead, but one thing was certain: there was no turning back now. The following days felt like a blur. Maya and Ryan worked tirelessly, poring over files, crafting strategies, and preparing for the uphill battle ahead. Ryan's experience with high-profile stories proved invaluable as he guided Maya through the intricate world of media and corporate resistance. While Kira handled the online platform, gathering testimonies and working on the website's security, Maya focused on building a case that could stand up to Crescent Airlines' legal might. Each new detail they uncovered felt like another piece of the puzzle, but it also deepened the gravity of their mission. The more Maya learned about Crescent Airlines' practices, the more disgusted she became. They had been manipulating data to make it appear as though their complaints were few and far between, but the truth was evident in every email, every document, every lawsuit they had quietly buried. She even found evidence that some employees who tried to expose the airline's practices had been fired or silenced with non-disclosure agreements. It wasn't just the passengers who were being hurt. Crescent was actively suppressing the voices of its own workers. Maya's phone rang late one evening while she was going through a set of contracts she'd gotten her hands on. It was Kira. "Maya, we have a problem," Kira said, her voice tight with urgency. Maya felt her stomach drop. "What happened?" "They're onto us," Kira said. "I just checked the analytics on the website, and someone has been tracking the submissions. There's a pattern of IP addresses logging in from Crescent Airlines corporate headquarters." Maya's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean, tracking us? Are they watching everything we do?" "I'm not sure yet," Kira replied. "But I think they might have a team working on damage control." If they're monitoring the submissions, it's only a matter of time before they come after us. Maya stood up from her desk, pacing. We knew this was coming. We knew they'd try to stop us. We need to be smarter about this. We can't let them scare us off. I'm not scared, but we need to be strategic, Kira said. Let me check some more details and make sure we're secure. If they're onto us, we need to be prepared for whatever comes next. After hanging up, Maya tried to calm herself, but her mind raced. She knew Kira was right, they had to stay one step ahead. If Crescent Airlines was monitoring them, they'd be ready to do whatever it took to undermine their progress. It could be the first sign that the airline's PR team was gearing up to spin the narrative, to discredit Maya and her cause. But how far would they go? Would they resort to legal threats, or worse, try to intimidate or silence her? For the next few days, Maya and Kira took extra precautions, encrypting their communications and changing their IP addresses to make it harder for anyone to track their movements. But even as they grew more vigilant, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something much bigger than they had anticipated. She wasn't just facing a corporation with immense power, she was up against an entire system that would do whatever it took to protect its interests. Meanwhile, Ryan was busy reaching out to his contacts in the media. He had already drafted a pitch for several major news outlets, but the moment Maya saw it, she felt a knot form in her stomach. It was everything they needed to break the story, bold, urgent, with a clear call to action. But it was also risky. The airline had the resources to bury this under layers of corporate spin. If they went public too soon, they could open themselves up to an all-out war with Crescent Airlines and its powerful network of lawyers and media consultants. I think we need to wait a little longer, Maya said, her voice low but firm. We can't just throw this out there without a full plan in place. We need to have our evidence airtight, and we need to have people backing us up. Otherwise, they'll tear us apart. Ryan nodded, though he looked conflicted. I understand your hesitation, but the longer we wait, the more time they have to cover their tracks. We have the momentum now. If we don't act soon, we risk losing our chance. Maya was quiet for a moment, considering his words. She knew Ryan was right, there would never be a perfect time. But the stakes were high, and her gut told her that once they made the story public, there would be no going back. We need to have more testimonies, Maya said finally. We need a larger group of people who can speak up. If we can get others who have been directly affected, it'll strengthen the case. It can't just be one woman who's